Okay, our next chapter is chapter 13, and going with our theme of food, we're now talking about food preservation and food safety. And in the same way that microbes are very important in the production of food, as we saw in the last chapter, um, microbial contamination of food can be a major problem in terms of food safety. So after reading this chapter, we should be able to identify the intrinsic and extrinsic factors involved in food spoilage, name some bacteria and fungal species involved in food spoilage, assess the efforts on food spoilage, uh, for example, meats, fish, eggs, dairy, fruits, vegetables, and grains. We can identify several factors important to food preservation and describe the challenges uh, to the preservation of food, or sorry, prevention of foodborne disease. So, one of the most common uh, microbial hosts uh, that will come into food is with salmonella. Okay, and salmonella is very prominent in poultry because salmonella is a part of the normal flora of most chickens. Okay, um, and so we can have kind of many foods that have salmonella uh, problems. Um, and where this will come from is from improperly prepared foods um, and foods that become contaminated. Um, so, one of the things that we think about when we're preparing foods is keeping it cold until we want to actually heat them up. And then once we heat them, we want to get them to a temperature which is hot enough to actually keep things from growing. And of course, there are methods including drying, temperature, which will help prevent food spoilage. So let's talk about food spoilage. Uh, Food spoilage is the microbial processes that cause foods to become uh, undesirable for human consumption. Um, and this can either be off scents, off odors, um, wrong tastes, um, or the actual physical breakdown of the food product. And now, one of the things that was historically done was to add spices to the food. And we now think of spices as a flavor thing, but mostly it was to uh, preserve the food. We can mask some of the smells and or taste, um, and those spices also turn out to be antimicrobial, and they keep the bacteria from actually growing. Um, so we have a number of foods listed here, and we're looking um, at the percent lost and the percent consumed um, versus different kinds of different products. Um, and we know that some things like uh, milk um, is very perishable, um, and we still do consume quite a bit of milk, but something like a seafood, we have a huge loss because the seafood is very highly contaminated with microbes. Um, so most products are going to have a shelf life, and that shelf life is simply the time food can be stored. Uh, and you all sort of know this without maybe thinking about it ever, but something like dry spaghetti has a very long shelf life, and cooked spaghetti obviously has a much shorter shelf life. But the dry spaghetti, because there's no water present, and the bacteria all need water to be able to live, to be able to cause the contamination. When you have a dry pasta, it's just not going to support life, so it's going to have a much longer shelf life. Okay. Labeling date, and that's another way of saying the expiration date. And again, this is something I hope that after this class you'll care a little bit more about. So, for example, on something like milk, there's always a don't use after date on milk, and maybe you have to uh, give up a little bit of milk once you get to the uh, expiration date, but it's better to be safe than sorry. And so maybe it costs you a little bit of money, but it might be better to make sure that you're not going to get any contamination. We also have to consider the microbial load. And so the microbial load is simply the number of microbes present. Um, and obviously, the smaller the load, the smaller the chance of actually having some contaminant that is compatible with that food. Microbial contamination uh, simply means that we can get microbes from air or soil, and these are going to be things that uh, occur naturally. Um, but also, when you have things like rodents or insects, um, those can bring in more microbes. Um, and you might think, well, ants are fairly uh, innocuous. They don't really, cause much of a problem. But remember, those ants can carry in bacteria on their feet, and so there could be a whole lot of contamination going on just because there's some ants present. So conditions for spoiling, the intrinsic factors and extrinsic factors. Okay, so intrinsic factors, um, things like the water content, the pH, and the physical structure of the product, um, how uh, water content can be thought about as how dry something is. And so things that are dry are going to be much harder to spoil. And then there's the example of having some pasta in the background there. pH, things that are more neutral, like a fish or a banana, are going to spoil quicker. Things that are kind of acidic, like lemons, limes, um, those aren't going to spoil as quickly because it's very hard to get a microbe to be able to grow in a low pH environment. The physical structure, um, if you have sort of ground meat is going to spoil much quicker than a solid piece of meat because in a solid piece of meat, there's nowhere to get inside of the meat and there's less surface that's exposed. Whereas in something like ground meat, you can have a lot of surface for the microbes to attach to. Okay. Um, Now, extrinsically, things like the temperature, so you can either freeze something or refrigerate it. And we sort of all know that from, again, thinking back to milk. You always keep the milk in the refrigerator because you want to keep the microbial counts low and the bacteria just don't grow at lower temperatures. So the perishability of food is based on the growth conditions. Um, Foods that are highly perishable uh, are fresh things, um, fresh cheese, butter, milk, meat, eggs. Those are all things that are going to perish pretty quickly. Now we can have some semi-perishable foods, breads, uh, fruits and vegetables, uh, a little more resistant to um, the the action of them being broken down. And of the non-perishable foods, those again would be things that are still in a can or things that are dried out, things that are prepared with lots of sugar, lots of salt. Those are all things that are going to take a whole lot more uh, to be perishable. Now, one thing you might want to think about as you're eating meals for the next couple of days, um, look at each of the foods that you're eating and decide which category they would go into. Okay, whether that's a highly perishable, semi-perishable, or a non-perishable food. And you can also go into a little bit of detail as you're thinking about it. If you put something in a highly perishable food source, why did you put it there? What is it about that food that makes it um, have a shorter shelf life, say? Okay, let's talk about some of the microbes which are important in food spoilage. There are a number of bacteria, the Bacillus species and Clostridium species, uh, Lactobacillus and Linococcus, or sorry, uh, Linococcus, uh, Salmonella, Escherichia, and Shigella, plus a number of other bacteria. Um, the thing about Bacillus and Clostridium species is that they always form spores. Okay, Bacillus forming spores aerobically and Clostridiums forming spores anaerobically, and both of them also produce toxins. Uh, the Lactobacillus and Linococcus, uh, they're going to be lactic acid producers, um, which we know from the previous chapter that those lactic acid bacteria are very important in the production of food, but they can also spoil some foods. And that uh, lactic acid is going to produce off colors or slime production. Uh, Salmonella, Escherichia, and Shigella are common gut bacteria from um, mammals, and they can be uh, found pretty widespread in soils and with plants. Now, among the yeasts and molds, Saccharomyces, just like we were talking about with making bread, um, certain molds, and probably among those, the most important of those might be penicillium. Um, so Saccharomyces is going to be mostly important in the spoilage of sugary foods, fruits and juices. The molds are going to be decomposers, and penicillium is going to spoil fruits, vegetables, and jams. Uh, so, uh, factors affecting food spoilage and shelf life. For fresh and processed meats, um, we have to prepare fresh meats. We have to keep them cold until they're prepared. Uh, and again, the meats are going to be highly perishable and can be the source of many contamination. Escherichia coli 0157H7 is one of the most dangerous uh, types of E. coli, and almost always, or is found in almost every food type known. Uh, it's a very specific type of E. coli that doesn't live in the human, but rather lives in the guts of some animals, and again can be very dangerous. It makes a very dangerous toxin. One of the problems with meats is that you can lose the red color, and as shown in that picture, uh, at a grocery store, uh, the meats are packaged in such a way that we get to see the red color, but you'll know after a certain amount of time that red color will definitely go away. Now, there are a number of meats that are processed or cured. Um, Luncheon meats um, tend to be processed or cured. Um, and of course, those things will keep the shelf life much, much longer. Um, Now, when you have spores of Clostridium botulinum, that is going to give you the disease of botulism. And in a lot of the cured meats, we can have the anaerobic conditions that the Clostridium botulinum will grow quite well. Okay. So fish can be a real problem. Um, it, again, it's highly perishable, has lots of protein, um, and are sort of uh, have factors from the water that they were swimming in that have microbial contamination. Okay, um, and many of the bacteria that are going to be living in the water are going to be adapted to colder environments, so that they survive out in nature, and your fish could be contaminated with those types of bacteria. Okay. Shellfish are filter feeders, and that's going to mean that they're going to be able to concentrate certain pathogens within their tissues. In terms of poultry, uh, like I was saying before, salmonella is a very, very common, just normal part of a chicken or poultry in general. Um, and that's going to be a source of contamination. Now, the inside of an egg is normally sterile, but remember that that egg had to come out of the chicken, which could be contaminated quite heavily with salmonella. Um, and so, while as long as the shell is intact, you don't have much to worry about. But as soon as you crack the egg to get the stuff out of the egg, then you're really worrying about um, contaminating the egg with the bacteria that are on the outside of the shell. Now, you can pasteurize things like egg whites, and these can be very good, especially if you're using an egg white where you're not going to be cooking the egg white before you put it into the syrup. So, for example, something like chocolate mousse, um, you usually use uh, uh, egg whites for that, and it would be best to use a pasteurized egg whites so that you don't get any contamination inside of your dessert. Um, Dairy products in general um, are uh, fairly perishable, and while milk is extremely nutritious, um, it can get contaminated quite easily, and that usually comes from diseased animal, especially at the milking station. If the animal is diseased, it can pass on the microbe that's causing the disease um, to uh, to the milk. Now, hard cheeses um, are going to be a little more stable because they have very low water content and they usually have fairly low pHs. Okay, and most of the bacteria want to grow at neutral pHs. Um, but uh, even though cheese was in a way developed so that its low moisture content would allow the milk to survive longer, there still is a period of time where you're not going to be able to get, you're not going to be able to keep cheese forever. Now, soft cheeses um, are going to be even more susceptible to contamination because there's just a lot higher water content, and you don't get that protection from the small amount of water in the hard cheeses. Okay, fruits and vegetables. Um, fruits uh, and vegetables, but are going to have microbes normally on their surface. These are either from where they were being grown or maybe something that got on them while they were being transported. And kind of the riper the fruit, uh, the easier it is to contaminate. Um, okay. We can have contamination with both molds and bacteria. And of course, again, because of the uh, lower amount of water, if you dry fruits, they're much less perishable. Most vegetables are at a very neutral pH and have a very high water content, which makes them again pretty perishable. We can get contamination from soil bacteria or mechanical uh, damage uh, to the vegetables. Um, and one of the things I think is in a way kind of funny. Think about potatoes or carrots. Obviously, those are things that are grown in the soil, and the part that you eat of a carrot or a potato is definitely inside the soil when it grows. So it's uh, almost impossible not to have contamination of carrots or potatoes. Grains and bakery products are fairly stable. Um, Grains can be contaminated by mold, and aflatoxin is probably the biggest player there. And I've actually done a lot of work with aflatoxin. Um, Aflatoxin is a human carcinogen. It will cause uh, liver cancer, and there's a mold that can grow in with the grains. Not very common in this country, but in other parts of the world it is common. And again, the toxin is just totally deadly because it does cause cancer. Okay. Now, breads are going to be a little bit harder uh, to uh, get contamination of because when you bake a bread, uh, a lot of the water is evaporated. Bacillus species uh, can uh, be contamination of bread, and things like with cream fillings, so cream filled donuts, something like that. The cream filling is going to be very high in water content, and so it's going to be even a bigger source of can a bigger source of rottage. Okay. How do we keep our food preserved? How do we keep the microbes from actually getting into our food? Um, we can use heat, so you can do canning, and in canning, you're definitely heat sealing the can, and the product has to be able to be uh, boiled to go into the can. Um, in a commercial setting, you might be able to sterilize using an autoclave, which is essentially just a big pressure cooker. But when you can in general, if you can uh, uh, pressure cook the jars that you're going to do the canning in, um, you can get a lot of the microbes out of there. Now, we can do pasteurization, and like we talked about before, pasteurization is not complete removal of all the organisms. It's just getting rid of a vast majority, hopefully all the pathogens. Um, and we talked about it the other day You can either do pasteurization by holding at an elevated temperature or do a flash method where you very quickly raise the temperature to a slightly higher degrees. And you can also do an ultra high temperature method, which a lot of times will sterilize the food, um, but you raise to a very high temperature, but for a very, very short period of time. And there are just the temperatures that we went over the other day. Low temperature, uh, the low temperature is going to keep the enzymes of the microbes from actually working. Okay, and so uh, without any enzyme activity, the microbes both can't eat and they can't do the things they need to be able to divide. Now, we do have psychotropic organisms, and those are things that like to live at cold temperature. Freezing is a good method of reducing microbial load because the bacteria just can't increase in number if they're in a freezing situation. Now, a very popular method for food is to dry things out. Um, and so, as soon as you don't have any moisture around, you can't support the microbial growth. And that's why things like uh, dried pasta are very stable products because you just don't have any moisture for the microbes to attack the pasta. We can also, if you have a specialized system, you can do lyophilization or freeze drying, um, and that's a very good way of preserving uh, things, especially like a vegetable. Um, if you can lyophilize it, then you can basically have a dried out vegetable for quite a long time. Now, the other way to keep things uh, safe is to increase the osmotic pressure, and basically that is uh, increasing the salt or the sugar in the food. Okay, um, and like I was saying earlier, uh, you can salt certain foods, and like a salami or some lunch meat like that. High salt content is going to keep the microbes from being in there. Um, Also, highly sugared things. Okay, so think like fruit cocktail, where you have just incredibly sweet syrup, and what that does is it, the osmotic pressure basically is taking away all the water. Okay, so if you have a lot of salt or a lot of sugar, there's no room for the water to get into the product, and then again, it's the drying effect that we talked about previously. If you don't have a lot of moisture, they just won't work. So, in other words, the microbes are going to dehydrate if they have a lot of salt or sugar. We can use chemicals to preserve things. Um, so, these can be things like organic acids. Um, One that comes to mind is acetic acid, which, as we talked about in the previous slides, um, if you have dilute acetic acid, that's vinegar. Okay, so both the low pH and just the fact that uh, it's it's an acid uh, is going to uh, keep those foods preserved. And those are just some other examples of some of the organic acids that you might be able to use in preservation. We can use radiation, okay? And there are a number of different kinds of radiation that can be used. Um, UV light is certainly a fast and easy one. Um, Things that are a little more penetrating, like X-rays or gamma rays, can also be used. Of course, there really isn't such thing as home irradiation of these products. That has to be done in a factory. Okay, so how do we prevent foodborne disease? Um, so in a food infection, the microbes are in the food. Okay, um, that you can contrast that with food intoxication, where when food intoxication, uh, the microbes made a toxin and deposited that on the food, and the bacteria don't have to be present anymore. Okay, just the toxins present. Or here in a food infection, the microbes must be present in the food. Okay, and this is most often going to cause some kind of gastroenteritis, and that's because the bacteria are going to be growing after the food has been ingested. Okay, in food poisoning, um, the toxin is consumed, but not necessarily any of the microbe. And food intoxication, like I said, is kind of food poisoning where it's the toxin that is present, not necessarily the microbe being present in the food anymore. Okay, so some helpful suggestions: um, reduce uh, foodborne illness, and you can prevent by avoiding foodborne diseases. Um, Again, keeping your foods uh, cold until they're heated to the right temperature as they're cooked. Um, and then after they're cooked, again, get them back in the refrigerator and again, keep them cold so that there aren't microbes um, to, to break or uh, to make more microbes that could go on to give more microbial toxins. Uh, we have a number of cases of salmonella, and a lot of times, like I told you, that salmonella was very common in chicken, and so a lot of times people will cut up their chicken on a cutting board and then use the same cutting board to cut, say, vegetables, and when the meat went down on the cutting board, that contaminated the cutting board with a lot of the salmonella. Then the salmonella survived long enough to be picked up on the vegetables that are being cut on the same cutting board. Okay. So, especially people who are in food service industry, um, know about the HACCP systems, um, and this is just a food safety system. Most important in seafood, meats, and poultry. And during its processing, you have to look at the critical control points. And you can look at that section 13.3 in the book. Okay, so what we should get from this lesson: the general factor is important. in food spoilage, the conditions for spoilage, the microbes typically involved with foodborne illness, how different foods spoil, methods to prevent spoilage, and challenges to combat foodborne illnesses. Um, so, just a thought question: what experiences have you had concerning foodborne illnesses and food preservation? Uh, Very importantly, there, um, probably almost everyone has gotten even just a little bit sick from food poisoning. Um, Very often, it could just be an upset stomach, and it might go away after a few hours. Um, so you don't really think too much about it. But if it does happen, you want to make sure to figure out what the source was, so that you don't eat the same thing again.